Thank you, Madam Speaker. And today I'll be speaking about the housing affordability crisis in Saskatoon and also speaking to our motion, which attempts to get something actually done on housing compared to 6 years of Liberal inaction. Now, first, this is my first speech in the 44th Parliament, and I just want to do some quick thank yous. I want to thank the residents of Saskatoon West for choosing me to represent them here in Ottawa, and it's my honor and privilege to do so. And I want to thank the people that live in diverse neighbourhoods like Riversdale, Hampton Village, Downtown, Caswell Hill, Blairmore, Confederation, Montgomery, and the many other areas of the riding. It's my honor to serve everyone in the riding. I want to thank my family and friends, my wife, my Cheryl, my sons Kyle and Eric, my parents Alvin and Irene, my extended family and friends, and also the member for Carleton Terrell Eagle Creek and her husband Milton Block for their support and encouragement over the years. And of course my campaign team who got me here, Stephen, Daniel, Lisa, Jared, Sam, Carol, and Oliver, and all the other folks who donated and worked tirelessly to get me elected. I also want to thank the leader of the official opposition for appointing me as Deputy Shadow Minister for Citizenship and Immigration. Now, the last speech I gave in this House was in June, 6 months ago. Instead of coming back after the summer break, we had an unnecessary election. And it saddens me to say that on August 15th, when Kabul was falling to the Taliban, when Afghan interpreters who risked their lives for our troops were fearing for their own lives, our Prime Minister was scheming with his party to call an election. And we know the outcome of that election, $600 million spent to keep the status quo. Parliament quiet for 5 months. And now we're back to the same old game of the NDP supporting the Liberals. And the sad part is that it wasn't necessary. Before the election, the leader of the NDP pledged his unwavering support to the Prime Minister. We will vote to keep the government going, he said in February. In August, he tweeted a plea to the Prime Minister to not hold an election, saying New Democrats are eager to help expedite legislation. And just in November, he said, if the government wants to pass legislation, they can count on us. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of Afghans wait. Now, speaking of elections, the Prime Minister has been quick to mischaracterize our election platform when it comes to housing. This gives me a chance to remind him and the entire Liberal caucus of our real plan. Canada's Conservatives committed to build 1 million homes in the next 3 years, to address corrupt practices such as money laundering that have driven up prices, to make it easier for more families to get a mortgage, to build more homes near publicly funded transit, to ban foreign investors from buying homes if they're not planning to move to Canada, and to partner with municipalities and the private sector to build new rental units and encourage foreign investments in affordable, purpose-built rental housing for Canadians. And in the spirit of reconciliation, address the housing needs of our Indigenous communities. And to redeploy underutilized government buildings into housing. This is a Conservative plan for housing in action. Someday soon we will be in government, and when we are, Parliament will be sitting, ministers will have mandate letters, and we will implement sound legislation that builds Canada up instead of tearing it down. In the meantime, we'll do our best to hold this government to account, and our motion today is just one of the ways that we can do that. Now, we know that the government is the largest property owner in the country with over 37,000 buildings. We also know that much of this space is underutilized. Conservatives want to turn at least 15% of this space over for homes. Now, in Saskatoon, the federal government owns 37 properties with over 1,000 hectares of land. This includes 98 buildings with a floor area of 146,000 square meters. So 15% of that is 22,000 square meters, or about 75,000 square feet of housing. At 750 square feet per house, that is 100 new homes in Saskatoon alone. This is a Conservative plan for housing in action. I'm also calling on the Liberal government to commit to never introducing a capital gains tax on the sale of primary residence. The Liberal campaign plan on page 13 promised to begin taxing the sale of primary residences. Initially, primary residences owned less than 1 year would pay the tax. But we all know these rules change over time. The Liberal spending spree will eventually force them to expand this tax. It's a slippery slope that I want to stop before it even gets going. And I know that folks in Saskatoon would be very upset by such a tax, and that's why I'm calling on the Liberals to stop their plans to tax primary residences. I'd like to provide an update on the housing situation in Saskatoon, Madam Speaker. Much of the focus is on the large metro centres like Toronto and Vancouver, but we have many of the same housing affordability problems in Saskatoon. I held a town hall on this very subject in the spring and received significant feedback. Participants spoke about the impacts on everyday working people, the impacts on seniors, especially the impacts for those on minimum wage and on government support. Firstly, they talked about the price of homes that's continuing to rise. Now, in Saskatoon, it's not as much as in the bigger centers, but it's still 6% year over year. And even at that rate, a house will increase in price by 70% in 10 years. Now, for a young couple, it seems impossible to save up enough for a down payment. And it forces nearly everyone to opt for the 5% down payment option. The problem is that CMHC insurance fees eat up almost all of that down payment. So the typical first-time homebuyer claws and scratches to save, only to give that down payment to the government. But at least interest rates are low, right? Not for long. The historic lows are coming to an end, meaning big surprises for homeowners at renewal time. To provide context, my first mortgage 30 years ago was at 13%. Do you know why rates were that high? Stay tuned, I'll talk about that in a minute. The second thing I heard was the cost of rent that just keeps going higher. A cheap place in Saskatoon is $1,000 a month now. That's well beyond the affordability of many lower income folks. It forces people to share housing, to couch surf, or just simply live on the streets. I've had many immigrants say to me that they came to Saskatoon because rent and house prices were low. This is no longer the case, causing some of them to have to move away to larger centers. Thirdly, people spoke about the direct impact on our homeless population. More and more people are sleeping on the streets. And besides COVID, addictions, and mental health problems, now the cost of housing is further complicating the lives of our homeless population. Just this morning, Saskatoon City Council was forced to approve a plan for a temporary shelter to house 50 people over the winter as an emergency measure. Well, what about the Liberals' Rapid Housing Initiative? As our local paper said, Saskatoon struck out at the first round of $1 billion, and apparently Saskatoon wasn't a target area for Liberals' spending. Finally, last week, the government did pledge $7.5 million to build 34 homes, but it's a very modest start, and I believe the government should be embarrassed, considering that Saskatoon is one of Canada's 20 largest cities. I mentioned my first mortgage was 13% 30 years ago. Do you know why rates were so high back then? Out of control government spending, which led to inflation. Which government was in power for most of the years leading up to this crisis? It was the Liberals. Who was the Prime Minister that started all of this excessive spending? Pierre Elliott Trudeau. There's a direct link between excess government spending and inflation. Excess spending increases inflation, which increases interest rates. It's just a matter of time, and it appears that time is now. We can't just blame COVID. The Liberal spending spree started long before COVID, as reported by the Parliamentary Budget Officer just this week. They've been adding programs and civil servants from the first day they were elected. Their philosophy is that government is the solution to every problem. The more and bigger government, the better. The Finance Minister said it would be irresponsible not to borrow money since interest rates are so low. The Prime Minister famously said he doesn't think about monetary policy, which means he's not worried about inflation. He's not worried about the economy. The Liberals made a $1 trillion bet that interest rates would stay low, and it appears that he was wrong, and homeowners will pay the price. And of course, food inflation we've seen at 15%, housing inflation more than 20%. Average paychecks are barely rising. These are real-life consequences for a Prime Minister and a Finance Minister who have clearly stated they do not care about the economic consequences of their actions. Inflation is rising, and interest rates will surely follow. Contrast that with the Conservative plan that has two underlying foundations. One, that deficit spending and massive debt will hurt our long-term prosperity. Any Canadian who piles credit card debt on top of credit card debt knows that reality. Eventually, it gets out of control. And two, that current macroeconomic reality means that inflation is out of control. Wages are stagnant and prices are going up. Purchasing power goes down, people get poorer. Conservatives have always been the party Canadians turn to when the economy needs mending. We are here to provide solutions to Canada's housing crisis. Conservatives have always fixed the mess created by the Liberals, and we will do it again. Thank you, Madam Speaker.